I'm curious when you think the dam is going to break.
If I don't do my job right in Washington, then innovation could be choked off and great things for human beings will not happen. We're competing for our kids' future with China over all these technologies that we're responsible for, robotics or quantum or generative AI or self-driving cars. If you don't pivot, you will die.
On this episode of To The Point, a Pinkston podcast, Gary Shapiro, CEO of the Consumer Technology Association. They represent more than 1,300 consumer technology companies and own and produce CES in Vegas every year. Shapiro is a best-selling author, and his latest book, Pivot or Die: How Leaders Thrive When Everything Changes, is out now. Of course, we discuss the book on the podcast, but we talk about a lot more: regulation across the globe, innovation, and where Shapiro sees the U.S. both leading and falling behind if we're not careful. It's a conversation I am sure you'll find fascinating. Now, enjoy the show. All right, Gary, thanks so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to be on To The Point.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So before we jump into your most recent book, Pivot or Die, excited to talk about that, had a chance to read it ahead of time. I wanted to ask you some personal questions because I always find it interesting, someone in your role, what are the questions that every morning you wake up thinking about?
Wow, that's a great question because I feel like I should say something profound. I always want to know what I'm supposed to wear that day because that's the big question, honestly, and whether or not I'm going to get up in the right enough time to work out and what I'll eat for breakfast. But that's not what you're asking about. I think you're asking me about, what do I want to accomplish that day at work, or what do I worry about?
Sure. Yeah. Since you haven't gone with the standard Steve Jobs turtleneck, you have diversity in your wardrobe. Yeah, what question?
No, it's not a matter of diversity. Do I have to wear a tie is the question of the day,
Gotcha.
always. And do I have to, make sure there's no spinach between my teeth because there might be a video involved, a Zoom call or something like that. So what I worry about in the big picture of my job is, so I had a nonprofit trade association of 1,300 technology companies, and we own and produce the largest technology event in the world, or the largest business event, the CES, held each January in Las Vegas, which is just a great, fun, focused, innovation-focused event. What I worry about is if I don't do my job right in Washington, then innovation could be choked off, and great things for human beings will not happen. And in Washington, and in Europe, frankly, I just came from a meeting with some Europeans on this, and I was in Europe last week, is that there's a fear, essentially, of the unknown, of the new. And the regulators and government people, especially, their temptation is to regulate it. In fact, Europe, their number one export, in my view, right now, is regulation. And they haven't had a successful big company in a long time, and we have dozens of them in the United States. But jointly, we're competing for our kids' future with China over all these technologies that we're responsible for, whether it's robotics or quantum or generative AI or self-driving cars, or all these other things we're involved in, and some we don't even know will be involved in the future. And China has strengths and we have strengths, and we could talk about that, but that's my big fear overall. And then there are other sub-issues there, like, for example, to power a lot of these new technologies requires energy. Where's that going to come from? It's just, you're talking about electric vehicles and quantum and generative AI. They use massive amounts of electricity. And although some people who promote electric cars, for example, think, oh, it's a problem to all the green problems, it's not. It creates other problems. We need a power grid, we need reliable sources, and we're struggling without even being there. And if you look at California, for example, where they cut off supply and they cut off all these things and their prices are super high, electricity and energy are an issue. So there's a lot of issues, but a lot of them come down to policy. And producing CES, that's a big responsibility of ours. We gather the world's biggest innovators all in one place in Las Vegas. So we have 140,000 people, 45% from outside the United States, and they come there, and if they don't get together in a meaningful way and learn about what each other are doing, then we won't progress. So those two big responsibilities, producing the world's event for innovation and fighting in the United States and actually even externally on behalf of American companies to make sure that we can get our competitive strength, which is innovation, out there without either being ripped off by the Chinese or having other issues by regulation of the Europeans in a way where we have to cooperate with both. That's what keeps me up at night, much more than whether or not I wear a tie to work.
There are so many different directions we could go with that answer. I mean, I want to pick up on what you just said about 45% of CES attendees are international. And you mentioned China in your answer. Where do you think the U.S. is right now in terms of leading internationally? And how are we viewed in the world when it comes to the most important innovations of the next century, whether it's quantum, generative AI, solving issues around energy?
The U.S. is in a great position, but our self-confidence in that position is sometimes not justified. So if you measure us by the number of great big new companies and leading in technology and our great universities and our focus on research and development, and frankly, the creativity of the American people and the fact that we attract people, the smartest people from all over the world who want to come here, which is a great thing, we're in a great position. On the other hand, starting with what I just said, is we're not welcoming those people anymore. Our immigration laws are not focusing on letting in this world's brightest people. That competitive strength is going away. In fact, we're anti-immigration in almost everything now. We also are complacent. And we also have a government that's not only not appreciating the role of innovation and the role of our biggest companies, but it's actually affirmatively blockading them and convincing the Europeans to fine and block them from doing what they should be doing, which is acquiring bright, small startups and other companies. You know, the fact that the Federal Trade Commission went to Europe and had them block Amazon buying our only, vacuum robotics company, iRobot, which makes the Roomba, and we had to lay off a lot of American citizens immediately and let the Chinese dominate the market is unconscionable. And we find our regulatory structure in Washington is working against our biggest competitive strength, which is our economy and our creative companies. And it's just not in technology. There's also in all sorts of business, necessary business, whether it's energy production, creativity, the motion picture, music, bio. There's not a sense in our government anymore, and I'm talking about even both parties to a certain extent, that business is really important in America, and we are leading the world, and we assume it's our God-given destiny. It'll always be that way. But yet it's a continuing battle. And right now where technology is going, frankly, the Chinese have some major advantages, especially if you look at generative AI, where huge data sets are important and privacy doesn't exist. And they socially rank all their citizens, and they don't have debates over things like abortion and social issues or gun control. They don't even have debates. They just go forward on a strategy focused on grabbing the most important and innovative technologies, either through borrowing or stealing some of what others have produced, or insisting that the government partner, or blocking all sorts of things. For example, all their health records are in one government ministry. 1.4 billion records. So you could take those records and you could just analyze them and figure out all sorts of different ways of treating people based on their age, their sex, where they grew up, what they eat, all sorts of their blood type, all sorts of things that differentiate us as humans, and come up with customized solutions. We don't have that ability. Europe, on the other hand, they share our love for democracy and freedom and choice and the sanctity of human beings with certain inalienable rights. But they go too far. Everything is about privacy and regulating and protecting Europeans and the rest of the world from any perceived thing from a new technology. So they have absolutely choked off major company formation in Europe. It's tough to come up with examples of big companies that have started there in the last 20 years, and that's hurting them. Self-driving vehicles, which would save lives and cut healthcare costs dramatically in the U.S. and free up healthcare workers for what we need them for, has been paralyzed in the U.S. by the Biden administration, who has shifted us from what Trump and Obama did, which was start on a course of self-driving. And they're responsive to the unions and the trial lawyers bar, the carnage industry, the trial lawyers who make a lot of money off the #1 lawsuit filed in the U.S. For example, with generative AI, though, and privacy, states are jumping in because the federal government is not, and it's really tough to deal with 50 states all having passing laws. Our strength over Europe is that we have one market, one system, one language, and yet the Europeans are actually doing better in some areas because they have focused on their laws on a EU basis. And of course, China, they don't care about privacy at all. And I think our job is that in the United States, we have to look at China, who's clearly a strategic competitor in the long run, and they are going after every one of these major technology categories, and they're doing it through their schools, 1 million engineers a year, and government funding and everything else, and no privacy, and huge data sets. And Europe, which has all privacy, no innovation, and we want to be like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We don't want the porridge too cold. We want it too hot. We want it just right. And that's the balance. The good news, though, is actually on generative AI, the Congress is actually being very methodical and careful, and they're on their way to doing it right, where they're listening to people. They're doing it in closed-door sessions. They're listening to everybody, consumer groups, labor unions. I mean, clearly the Senate hearings, which I participated in, was heavy on a lot of people who are saying the sky is falling, the labor unions and consumer groups and all that, but they're listening to business interests as well, and they're weighing it, and they're being very methodical. Same thing with the House of Representatives. They're moving some legislation along. So I'm optimistic about generative AI because we're so good at it in the United States. Robotics, some of the other categories, self-driving, I'm a little less certain. And the other thing that has to happen is we have to look at all the ingredients that come in. Like we say, oh, let's go to electric cars. We don't consider all that means, including the power grid we need, including charging stations, including the fact that we're relying on China for rare earth minerals to power all this. We're ignoring things, but the pendulum has swung here. Look at the deal that was cut recently on nuclear power. 3 Mile Islands, thanks to Microsoft, is going up. That's huge. And I think the Congress has passed legislation now on nuclear power, and the opposition to nuclear power has gotten much more subdued. Even the green groups are coming along and saying, look, compared to coal and all these other things, there are risks, but we can manage them. We've never had a nuclear death in the United States from a nuclear power plant.
I want to talk about what you just mentioned with generative AI, self-driving cars. I lived in Phoenix for 5 years, so I saw the Waymos out, constantly, and they were starting to pick up in the last 12 months and actually take people on rides. But it feels like we've kind of had this very almost gradual, boiling a frog, where we don't realize all the major technological shifts underway. I'm curious when you think, or if you think, the dam is going to break at some point and there's going to be this crazy moment where we kind of cross over into self-driving cars are on the road, and how quickly that will happen. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years where our entire offices look different because of generative AI, where the roads look different because no one's actually controlling the wheel? How do you think through that?
Well, we're definitely in the middle of a technology revolution, which is analogous to the shift to the internet with definitely with generative AI. Certainly self-driving cars is a different category, but it does use generative AI. That's what it's using, essentially. But I think technology revolutions, when you're in the middle of it, you don't experience it. It is a little bit like the lobster boiling in the pot. It's just very slow, day to day. Things don't change. But the path. It's a predictable path the way it was with the internet. Some of the other technologies that came along, I was very much involved in the transition of the internet, and I personally was involved in a bipartisan effort to get literally what ended up to be global laws on commerce in the internet. I was involved in the shift of television systems, which seemed enormous at the time, and the U.S. developed the shift to the best system in the world, HD TV. By far, that was beautiful. Both of those are beautiful cooperation between industry and other stakeholders and government, and a consensus, and there was a goal there that we agreed upon of where we wanted to get. And I think we have to do that. I mean, I'm waiting for a political leader to say, we have a goal, for example, with self-driving cars. We want to cut the 40,000 deaths down and several 100,000 people that are maimed and admitted to hospitals from vehicle accidents. We want to cut that down by X% by X date. And there's not that vision. Now, we will have a new president in a few months, and that president will make a decision whether they want to keep going solely down this electric car path and forget about self-driving and see that to China and Europe, or whether we want to transition and ignore the trial lawyers who make their money off of carnage and go forward to where the rest of the developed world is competing. Because we are shifting away from competing on self-driving. We're going behind at this point. We're behind that wheel, even though it would save lives. And I find that a tragedy for our country and for our competitiveness. But with electric cars, there's a place for them, but we put all our eggs in that basket. And that, to me, is proving to be a mistake rather quickly. We're seeing it in the auto industry results. We're seeing it in the shift, and that's a problem. With generative AI generally, I think we're still in the game. We're actually probably ahead of the game in the US if you look at the major companies, but we have to balance off legitimate privacy and freedom and liberty concerns against concerns about the greater good here.
You know, your book's called Pivot or Die. It sounds like what you just said is you think the president, whoever that is, needs to pivot on a number of things regarding not just technology, but the debt and other things. How do you think leaders make that tough decision to pivot when, let's say, the culture, the people around them are saying, we like the status quo, this isn't popular? What does it take for a leader to be able to successfully pull off a pivot?
Well, that's a great question, especially in the context of the presidential election. I really don't perceive the next president. I mean, we will have a new president, but I don't perceive the next president as necessarily making a pivot. I think there's a gap there in leadership in the country. And I think it's up to the business community to stand up and start saying, this is what we should be doing for the betterment of the country if you're willing to stand up. For example, our organization does not seek money for the technology industry from the government. We think the debt is so important in our organization that it's going to be devastating. It's already, our interest payments on the debt are bigger than our Defense Department expenditures. And it's $33 trillion. Figure out 5% of that, and you're spending close to $2 trillion on just interest, which you have to pay. So business leaders have to start talking about that. And certainly I've talked about it. I've published something in Fortune recently about what we should do. It's been in my books for 15 years talking about it. But there are other issues besides that. And a lot of it has to do with technology and innovation and how we get there. And recognize the fact that we are, it's easy to say, here's your enemies, and say China's an enemy. But China's a very big country. It's a competitor, but we have to cooperate with them. We really don't want to go to war with anyone. That's not in our national interest. And no one wins really in a war anymore. There's just two losers, and who loses less. So I think what we have to focus is on what the business community can do and make those pivots and make those decisions. Those are big macro decisions. And sadly, I don't think we're there yet, even as business leaders. But we are there as businesses and as individuals. And what Pivot or Die is about is how we make decisions, how we determine what are the big decisions. And it's also aimed at the personal decisions in life, which since I've reached a point in my career where I'm talking a lot to younger people and they're seeking advice, is the advice I give is that, look, I know you stress out over what college you go to or what your major is or where you go to graduate school, whether you go to law school or medical school or whether you get technical skills or whether you start a business. But there's only a few decisions in your life which are really important. And those are whether you commit a felony, whether you do something unsafe, whether you have kids, and who you marry. Those are really big decisions that should be very thoughtful. The rest of the decisions, it's like how we meet our significant others or spouses or what we do. A lot of it is learning about your self-experience, and it's random in a sense that, you're really not mature enough in your 20s or 30s to make some of these huge, big decisions, but you have to. But your first job really isn't that important because you'll learn about what you like. And so part of it is personal because I feel that, I've hit on some ways of dealing with those questions. And part of this is about business and how business leaders have made decisions, the ones in the technology world where you really have to move quickly or you die. I've seen in the business world that executives are making, and especially I've seen this in Asian countries, that sometimes they're making decisions based on consensus because everyone's afraid to disagree. In the US, we're really good at disagreeing with each other for the most part. We get a lot of practice at it, and failure is something where you learn from. So we have a lot of advantages here. But in terms of making the decisions in the tech world, if you don't pivot, which we all had to do in COVID, if you don't pivot, you will die. And just remember that everyone else is looking at the same data you are. And what I loved, I shouldn't say I loved something about COVID, but the silver lining of COVID was that businesses have learned that when you don't go the same direction as everyone else. You have to go off and take risks, and you have to do things differently because everyone is looking at it and taking the same picture in time and doing the same projections, and they're assuming you're not going to do that. So you really got to do things differently. And I'm seeing businesses go in all sorts of directions. Technology is helping them. We're also in the middle of this renaissance of technology, which is amazing. And it's an opportunity time like there's never been, except perhaps the creation of the internet or some gold rush where people thought they'd get a lot of money from gold.
Yeah, one of the things you talk about in your book is the kind of the four main pivots, at least from a business standpoint. You mentioned the personal pivot there. There's startup, forced, failure, and success pivots. All kind of different. Obviously, the failure and success pivot, kind of opposite sides of the coin. Which do you think is the hardest for businesses to make?
Well, you learn from your failures, and you don't have a choice in a failure pivot. So it may be hard, but you have to do it, and you don't have a choice. I like the success pivot because you can be very successful and you think you're so smart, but it might have been random and you might have been lucky. And it's not only making the good decision, it's the timing of the decision. A lot of companies are started or they issue a product that's just before its time, frankly, even though it's a great idea or it's not executed right. Which is the hardest to make? I think one of the toughest things, and I have great respect, is for entrepreneurs, because this country is built by entrepreneurs and startups, and it's so important that we continue to be able to fund them, and that's one of our competitive strengths. Sadly, it's going away as we don't allow big companies to buy small companies anymore by fear that they're going to be challenged by the Federal Trade Commission. So I'm fearful of that. But I think the startup mentality that we have in this country, based on failure is okay, it's a learning experience, is a valuable asset that we have. But being a startup and having a vision and pursuing it despite some of your friends and family may say, what are you doing? Why didn't you go get a job with a healthcare insurance or something like that? Takes a lot of courage. And that's where my respect is for startups and entrepreneurs. We need them, and that's our seed corn for our future. And I think as a national policy, we should be encouraging them. We should be allowing big companies to buy them and invest and partner, and not discouraging them and not encouraging the Europeans to find them and stop them. So I'm kind of at a low point in terms of national policy on this, but I'm at a high point in terms of where we are and our potential as a country.
How do you balance that, the thinking of letting, we'll say, large companies acquire startups with maybe the fear or concern that successful startups don't have enough time to grow themselves before they're gobbled up by an Amazon, a Meta, or a larger company that just wants to, acquire the potential threat?
Well, I think that's a very red herring kind of concern. I think I'm sure it has happened. There's some evidence with one of the companies that someone wrote an email in a vast company. They found an email that says, we better buy this company and put them to sleep for a while. And I'm sure it does happen. But, in the scheme of things, in entrepreneurial and innovative America, so what? I mean, that company's taking a risk that someone else is going to replicate that. But that's not why companies acquire companies. They acquire them because it's so much quicker and faster. Big companies are at a competitive disadvantage because it takes a lot of bureaucracy to get a yes and to start something new, especially if it's distant from the main core business. So big companies are not great innovators, and small companies are. And small companies are only funded by people who think they're going to get an exit. So it's a system that's working amazingly well in this country, and our federal government is really screwing it up badly. And this isn't, look, 80% of our members are smaller companies. This is their view as well, that we want to be acquired by some bigger companies. Let us decide if it's a time. Let us decide what percentage they take or what the deal is. But don't stop them from doing that, because you're killing innovation in America. And that's what gets me going every morning when I wake up. Because if I don't do my job right, I've screwed up. I've cut off something that could help humanity. And that's why we've partnered with the United Nations. The United Nations likes what we're doing, focus on innovation, recognize that we're going to provide solutions for human securities, whether it's access to food, healthcare, clean air, clean water, community. Even a year ago, I was at the UN, opening day of the General Assembly, and we were announcing with the UN a new fundamental human security, and that's access to technology, because it's going to make such a difference in the human condition. And that's what we're about, and that's what excites me. And that's why that book is out there, because I think it's important that people pivot and make changes, recognizing that change is difficult, it's uncomfortable, the status quo is comfortable, but we have to do it because we're human beings and we have to evolve, not only to ensure the survival of the human species, but just to make the world better for our kids and grandkids and everyone else.
If I gave you the ability to send a push alert to every American's phone, what would your one or two sentences be in the push alert?
Innovation is our future. It will save lives and make life better. Make sure your member of Congress knows and supports innovation.
A couple more rapid fire questions, kind of personal. If you had to sum up your leadership style in one sentence, what would it be?
Innovation focused. I deal with people where they are. People who report to me, they report the way they want to. They can do memos, phone calls, whatever. And also recognize that people respond to different things. People are all individuals, and to try to group them in categories. I used to focus on productivity. Now I focus on people.
Outside of Pivot or Die, which we obviously see over your shoulder, what one book would you recommend to people that you think they should read?
That I've written or that anybody's written?
Anybody. We'll open it up.
The Power of Now is a book that influenced me. A Canadian author just kind of wrote it in a weekend. But the point of the book is that you should try, like when we're kids, we live in the moment and we enjoy it. And as we get adults, we just spend a lot of time worrying about stuff, which is not really that healthy, or living in the past. And I think the moment is, life is a gift. And I think to the extent you can enjoy each moment, that's what one of my leadership style things is. I want our employees to really love their jobs and enjoy their work and see the value in it and enjoy each other. So that's my leadership style, but it stems from a little bit of living in the moment, but also thinking that you're doing something good in the long term. So I'd go with The Power of Now. But if you asked me a different day, I'd say Strunk and White, The Elements of Style. Everyone should read that so you could write better and speak better. So. And yesterday it would have been How to Win Friends and Influence People.
That's a classic. I just
bought yesterday by the guy who's running that organization, and I realized during the interview how much that book influenced me when I was a teenager. It's not something I'd ever thought about, but I realized that influenced me of having a positive, seeing the ability to see the world through, seeing the good side of any situation, assume good intentions. Deal with how you deal with people. So this is a new answer for me as of yesterday.
I mean, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's funny you say that. I bought 3 copies of that book in the last week for coworkers here. Because,
no way!
Yeah. So it's on my nightstand. I try and reread it once a year. It's so good. You cannot remind yourself of the principles in that book enough.
Well, the organization still exists. It's out there, and it's still training people.
Yeah. For those folks who haven't been to CES before but are considering it, maybe they're on the fence, what would you say to folks about why it is worth the investment, the time, and the money to show up at CES? What's it like being a part of those couple days?
Well, CES is January 7th through 10th in Las Vegas, and it's open to anyone with a connection to the innovation world, whether it's media or an innovator, an entrepreneur, a technology company, and it is inspirational. People who go there come back with 1,000 ideas, whether it's feedback as a startup because they're hit with so many different ideas from potential customers, like everyone from the CEO of Walmart to Mark Cuban go there, to people from around the world, startups, big companies go to there. It's just some of the serendipity. You just discover things. If you go there, you should go if you're on the fence, but if you go there, you should wear comfortable shoes, and you should also leave yourselves time to explore Eureka Park and bigger companies as well, and see how the big companies position themselves to the world. It's an incredible opportunity, but the smaller companies and the startups are there, and it's just they meld because no company could do it alone anymore. So it's also it's just relations. One thing COVID taught, I think, a lot of CEOs especially, is that the face-to-face experience is so important. I am the paid cheerleader for the innovation technology industry, but on the other hand, during COVID, like to try to deal with people just through a video screen, I felt like I was wearing cellophane all the time. You couldn't have the relationships, you couldn't have the serendipity, you couldn't share a meal or a cup of coffee, or just a discussion or learn about people anymore. And it felt like I was half a person. And I think that's a very frustrating feeling. So it helped us rediscover our humanity. And I think it's part of even the debate about coming back to the office. There's a whole generation of younger people who need and should get that mentoring that you could only get face-to-face, the sidebar kitchen conversations. And we're losing that. And that's why we're hearing announcements like companies like Amazon, everyone come back to work. Because face-to-face is so important. Even though Amazon's essentially a technology company, is what they do. But yet, look, they're requiring it. And there's something to be said, and there's balances to be worked out. But I really think that human connection is so important for us.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. Last question. Where and when can people go get Pivot or Die?
As of October 8th, any credible bookstore online, whether it's Amazon or any others, they'll have it. It's there. There's also an Audible version that I read myself. I really enjoyed it, and I'm passionate about it, so I think it's a little more fun and interesting because I've heard this feedback from other books. And there'll be a lot of discussion about it elsewhere. And it's pivot or die, and read it. Give me your feedback. I'd love to have it, or write a review, good or bad. Get it out there.
That was Gary Shapiro, CEO of the Consumer Technology Association. Really appreciate him coming on the podcast and you listening. If you like the episode, like, follow, subscribe, share, give it 5 stars, all that good stuff. Now, I'll get to the point and let you get back to your day. We'll see you next episode.